What a glorious prelude and fugue in C major. The prelude from Book 2 and the fugue from Book 1. That was always hope of mine that both books will hold hands. It is a fantastic combination, refreshingly so, between the 1720s and 1740s, two books in each tonality. I know that just like the table of multiplication, we as musicians are taught the prelude and fugues the way they come, and in the order in which they come, and in the way Bach paired them in Book 1 and Book 2, 20 years apart. Now, I don't know how many, if all, musicians have played all the 48, studied them, performed them, or taught them, or in part of each. In my case, as a child, I had to copy them, and from memory as well as from the score, on staffs with clefs, solfege it, sing it, as if almost before performing it I had to chew it. Forgive me for such familiarity with such masterpiece, but it's just to say that when the Book 1 and Book 2 start from C major to end up chromatically up in B minor, all the musicians reach a point where perhaps they give up when they study them, because they go from the C major of one of the books, let's say Book 1, and doesn't always finish complete, because there is other things to do. I mean, isn't it? So when we have to study and Chopin and Prokofiev and Ligeti and everybody, compared to if we had studied back then only that. Of course, also music from their own past, the Caspar Fischers and the Jacobs Frobergers and the Couperins, uncles and nephews, and all these great artists who pianists play less today besides Scarlatti and Handel, they should. But within the Bach, well, what was the Bach music of the time of Bach? It was obviously closer to Bach's time because little was available from the ancient masters. But today we are in the century of musical plethora of availability of the rarest scores researched by the greatest musicologists, scholars who devote their lives to specific niches where they make us understand the blossoming of Monteverdi, which then brings us to Frescobaldi, that Frescobaldi brings us to ultimately through many to Bach, and then we go into the classical era, and then of course Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, first Viennese school, then the Romantics, Chopin, Liszt, Schumann, Mendelssohn, Brahms, Weber, and so many more, and then of course what we call the modern, the ones on the turn of the century, the Schoenbergs, the Stravinskys, the Prokofievs, the Rachmaninoffs, the Scriabins, those who explored, those who regressed in terms of language, not in terms of their intensity to express their own self, which is so amazing for us to have incredible variety to study from, to nourish our intellect and our curiosity from, and then not to mention the so-called contemporaries, which technically means while being alive, therefore not the dead ones, but still closer to us, the Ligetis, the Boulez, the Xenakis, the Dalla Piccola, and so many more. And each of them, the more we get closer to our time, in terms of our living time, the more we realize that they're less into a group of composers, even if some are organized by Le Six with the French composers of the early 20th century, or the Mighty Five in Russia, but all these are intellectual organizations by school books. In fact, all these were very strong individuals who did or did not use the same inherited music language in terms of the tonal system, and then after that either altered it, either rejected it, either reinvented it or reorganized it, and ended up by being each of these composers having their own planets. So in a way, we have much less access by intuitive interaction to them compared to what we would do with a Schubert. And I didn't mention him in the Romantics or the Classics because I really don't know where he meets which end. I think he overlaps a lot. Of course, all of them, while played, are present. But for the Bach Prelude and Fugues, I find that to be a fantastic way to revamp our curiosity, to refresh our batteries, to re-energize our vitamins of our daily work with Bach. Bach gives solace. Bach brings order, organization, thought process, but also incredible sense of plethoric, exponentially expanding, I would say, blossoming. The voices come out of the other. They all interact so graciously, so meaningfully. They, the contrapoint, the most beautiful keyboard polyphony in Bach, the parts or the voices never collide. They do interact. They overlap. They become grand or shorter, but at the same time they're perhaps even inverted. But in any case, they espouse each other. It's all like as if we are brought to a musical universe where the harmonious organization prevails, regardless of the intensity of the especially minor mode dissonances, because inevitably they happen and they have to be there. These asperities exist. But there is no willful collision of voices. It feels like in Bach's music, all the parts thrive. That's the word. And they don't collide against each other. And very often, because the students are used to play a few of the Prelude and Fugues and inevitably spared by Bach, sometimes they don't go further because, as I said earlier, for lack of time, not only curiosity, but because there's no time to get in depth in anything, because we have to be competitive quickly, and because there's so many of us. And the teachers are drawn into this turbine where we have to motorically produce ready musicians to compete. But it takes time, not only to get the industry of playing, but also to get the musical understanding of the meaning of how you negotiate the flow of your musical lines, voices in Bach. It's not a melody and accompaniment. It's a dialogue, a trialogue, a quadrilogue, a quintologue between voices which are equal, even if we give it more importance by highlighting it, because some moving parts are heard more than the held parts because of the decay of the instrument, or because of the attention we give to the phrasing shape of each of those. In C minor, the second of the Prelude and Fugues, if you take the same combination, you can play the Book 2 as fugue combined with the Book 1's prelude, in which case it would be. You see? My reptilian of brain. I went back to the first fugue. I should have done. That I haven't played them, and I so enjoy them, like I rediscover them like fresh fruits. The gift that keeps on giving. Mademoiselle Boulanger, when I was a child, used to tell me it's a good companion for your life. Those Prelude fugues, they're like friends. Sometimes they hug, sometimes they bite, because sometimes you forget some of the elements, but you're driven through them because you can solfege them, you can sing them, you can write them, and you can almost make up in the middle if there is a gap, because you don't get lost, since it's not finger memorization. It's really the patterns of the drawing, of the gestures of the voices. Sol, mi, fa, sol, do, fa, mi, re, mi for the subject, do, si, do, re, sol, do, si, la, si for the answer. Sol, re, mi, fa, mi, re, do, si, la, sol. Sol, la, si, do, mi, fa, sol, la, re, mi, fa, sol. Of course, when you sing or speak solfege, it is, say in English, for the naming of the Italian or Latin words, names of the notes, we have the capacity of only saying one at a time. And so if you don't hold, therefore, the one that decays while the other one is moving, you always implement the one that is being, in fact, heard. Do, si, do, sol, la, do, si, do, re, sol, do, si, do, re, fa, sol, la, sol, fa, mi. For the subject of the book 1, as I mistakenly played the fugue in the beginning, since I want to combine it with the book 2. But the subject is the answer on the fugue's fifth, so, fa, sol, do, mi, so, fa, sol, la, re, so, fa, sol, la, do, re, mi, re, do, si. And then you have little bridge before the third voice, mi, re, mi, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, mi, fa, la, re, mi, fa, so, fa, sol, mi, fa, sol, la. Of course, you cannot. I have two mouths, so I have to go, but I have to think of one and then say the other in my head. Mi, re, mi, sol, la, fa, mi, fa, la, si, so, fa, sol, si, do, re, mi, fa. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do, for the other voice. And if I combine them, mi, re, mi, do, re, mi, fa, sol, fa, mi, fa, re, mi, fa, sol, la, so, fa, sol, la, si, do, re, mi, fa, do, si, do. And even if it's not in the pitch, because I cannot sing in the pitch, giving my voice, already solfeged from childhood, never mutated. Mi, re, mi, do, re, mi, fa, sol, fa, mi, fa, re, mi, fa, sol, la, so, fa, sol, mi, fa, sol, la, re, mi, fa, do, si, do. If you just spoken. So what I was saying earlier about the chewing, it's the pleasure of saying the notes, because in Latin denominations of the notes, it's easier to combine them fast, since they have a good amount, specifically so, of invented for that purpose, even if it comes from Guido d'Arezzo's psalm, first syllable of Latin chants for the Gregorian. But nevertheless, the combination of vowels and consonants helps. You don't have too much vowels in a row or too much consonants in a row. So it helps to say it. And when I play, sometimes I speak the notes to myself. Of course, I hear the pitches, since I had perfect pitch at the get-go, so I didn't have to search for them. And on the piano, you don't have, like on a string, wind or voice, to search for the pitch, because you don't have the ear to adjust. You just associate it to a button, to say the key. Of course, I'm sorry. Pianists don't have to be called buttons for their keyboards. It's keys. And I must say that it's such a rejuvenation, no matter how old you feel or how tired you feel or how perhaps sometimes lost in translation with many things in which you advance in your musical life as a teacher, as a performer, as an artist, or perhaps you try to find a point, a meaning, how to organize your interpretation, to bring a new, to rethink, food for thought, how to organize your interpretation compared to the how to not overperform what is already on the score, and how to not understate what is on the score. Sometimes you overdo so, because to teach, sometimes sometimes I have to exaggerate to make the point, and then hopefully the swing will balance in the middle for the student, who will acquire from these suggested thoughts processes, says how to organize their voice. Because if not, Richter used to tell me, when I asked him how he organized his thoughts for the fugues when he recorded them back in the 50s or whatever it was, before my time, because when I grew up on LP, Sviatoslav Richter's Well-Tempered Clavier was as famous, if not more than Gould's, since Gould was still alive. Fame comes with death. For some, and for some never. But in this case, fame came at the time of Richter's time, and I had an opportunity to study with him. And so when I asked him, he told me he doesn't think one should bring out the subject's entrances to the fugue, which is the point of demonstrating the understanding of the textures follow-up. He said, if not, it makes it a single voice piece. It's almost like as if me solfeging it. It's important to hear it with the secondary voices meaningfully intertwining around or under or above, beautifying the different entrances of the thematic materials of the subjects and the answers. Ah, that would be so good. If I could go back in childhood and redo that. Perhaps I do it through teaching. Seeing the young people, if they don't have the time, at least they try to do for sections of a fugue, not the entire fugue from memory writing down. But it helps to think of the understanding and to penetrate the thought processes of the composer, what comes after the next, which is the whole point of compose. You compose a train with wagons, you compose notes after each other, thoughts after each other, thematic materials, organizing them in a pre-organized rules, format, genres, style. Is it a dance, or is it a song, or is it an organized group of voices like in a fugue or in a quartet? Anyway, you have to swim in the texture, become the piece, be the piece. In C sharp major, he does. I'm sorry to say, but I have to stop and say it feels like an ever-flowing element. It's like you're on a stream. Supposedly Bach in German means that, a source, stream, flow. In the fugue. To organize it in the other order, then I could take C sharp major, but this time Book 2 is a prelude. How you realize when you start studying them, when you plunge in the depth of the details, you realize that there is a certain similarity between some of the preludes in the way he uses the toolbox, if there is such a not too familiar word to call this, because the first prelude of Book 1 is also arpeggios with patterns and repetitivity in slow-moving harmonies. And in the C sharp major Book 2, 20-some years later, in 1740s, he takes another pattern of the idea of the first book, C major, arpeggios with repeated patterns. And then instead of the Book 1, it's obvious that when he composed these exercises for the rare and difficult and rarely driven, visited tonalities like C sharp major, since the well-tempered clavier allowed this with the unisons on each note. Therefore, you reach the capacity to play in awkward tonalities in which not usually go. C sharp major is among the first of them. But he maintains the volubility of the words, of the fingers, because of the idea of practicing the velocity of the fingers, volubilities in the words, obviously, but it's in a rhetorical sense a translation of that, the bubble talk and the bubble play. And so the virtuosity, of course, has changed through time since then because of the instrument and the different eras. But still, in Bach's time, it was it's an important attempt to maintain this for Book 1 C minor, and the next one C sharp major also, and in the fugue of Book 2. He does some kind of a toccata, we'll call it today. Of course, that means touch, of course, to toccare from Italian touch, and Frescobaldi and so many before him, and his son, well, which one, right? In this case specifically, I have in mind CPE, Carl Philippe Emmanuel, who is the to be, after his father, the master of these fantasies and toccatas, where he has these fragmented virtuosity moments that are so modernistic compared to his father's organized world. And he's already breaking some of the mold, but it's all based on these touches. And he studied his father's exercises written for him. Johann Friedemann, his older brother and the firstborn, at least until the last born composer, but much later, since he was almost another generation, since he was 15 at his father's death in 1750, Johann Christian, who wrote much more galant style pieces of the and Mozart would even as a child visit him and take these few sonatas of his and make them into concerti. So the world goes on. It's like a exciting transmission, sometimes stealing, sometimes appropriating, and sometimes really receiving in mainstream. Of course, when you have Bach as a father and he writes your exercises, you study them, and then it inevitably develops your thought processes, and you start thinking like this virtuosically yourself. For the Ca Felipe Emanuel, I can imagine what he must have been. No, I can't imagine to have had Bach as a father. It's frightening and exciting at the same time. I remember one of my dear co-students during the Boulanger years of my studies, in her last 10 years of 90-some of life. It was, he's now a conductor, Neil Gittleman. And he used to say, when asked, do you have stage fright when you conduct? And he said, when you have studied with Boulanger, you don't have stage fright, because in a way, the lessons with her were frightening. So in a way, you learn how to defeat the stage fright by being asked very high tasks very early whenever you go to study with her. And he was a young adult, I was a child. Regardless, we knew what she expected. So I can only imagine, in comparison, perhaps at another level of dimension even, of things, how it must have felt for having Bach as a father if you studied with him. The expectations must have been so high. But anyway, that's another story. The point of the examples is that the two books can very well combine their preludes and their fugues. And that's what I wanted to share with you today. I know it's a silly thought. It could be not very important in terms of a musicological point of view, but I think it's a very refreshing way to rethink about it, because I think that the tonality was what essentially drove Bach to write those prelude and fugues, in order to prove how to play in those rare keys in which earlier we couldn't go when the harpsichords were tuned in certain keys only. Since it's kind of a universal way to go in the 12 tones of the chromatic scale, major and minor, 24, both books 48, 96 with the prelude and fugues all together. It doesn't mean that you can mix and match them as you like. You never are allowed that. But when the students copied them in order to study them for the next lesson, inevitably when they did their own books and they taught in turn, they were not always arranged and organized, because it was not printed yet in the order, and yet less all of them. And it was used as an example of practicing in some tonalities. And I think that through the 18th, 19th century, and Mendelssohn, who is credited rightfully for discovering Bach with his generosity while being conductor in Leipzig, where Bach died about 50 years later, of the orchestra, and organizing and founding a conservatory there too, etc., etc., bringing Schumann and Schumann's wife and so many to study and to teach, for all the students who were there, and re-immersed into Bach. I think little by little Bach's cataloging became more important in the later 19th century, but until then he was more or less not really organized, not all the cantatas, not all the everything that he wrote. He was more perhaps scarcely used, and therefore the prelude and fugues were not always matched. in that sense. Not that it had to be, because it's good that we have the catalog today system, but then because we do have it, doesn't mean that we have the time to go through all of them, to taste all of them, to plunge in all of them. In my case, I was a child, so I had the whole life in front of me, and my teacher thankfully, respectfully, and carefully. And so, while very old, should have been impatient, but was so patient to attend, guide, and organize my discoveries of these incredible timeless beauties, which become part of your life. You can sing it while driving, solfege it, ping pong it if somebody else solfeges it with you. You don't have per se to have to play it, but ultimately you do. That's what they're written for the keyboard, regardless if it's not today's piano back then, obviously. But still, you teach it today for the purpose of the organization of the thoughts of Bach, the lines, the musical aspect of the expression, and you perhaps override some ideas about interpretation in terms of dynamics colorization more than the textures contrasting colorizations which they used on the fortepiano, and back then in the harpsichord, of course, but there isn't a harpsichord, there are harpsichords, and there isn't a clavichord, but there are clavichords. And so I think every instrument, not to mention the tuning, wasn't always universal either, as we think of it today, of A at 440. But regardless, I think music was an experience for the soul and for the spirit and the brain, therefore through the fingers for the keyboard musicians and the harpsichord at home. I think it was of course the organ was the instrument of polyphony of Bach's favorite instrument. That's where he could unveil and unstoppably develop all these flourishing of blossoming of polyphony with the feet on top of the hands. Easy to say, difficult to do. Imagine all this independence of gestures, nothing but to think the music in layers and then organize it in orders and then perform it in shapes and then give it a certain breathing and expression that you, according to what you understand, he suggested, because he didn't write the expressions, they were not notated, or the tempi marking, that less the metronome, which wasn't invented until late Beethoven, what am I saying, late Bach? Late Beethoven in 1820s. So we don't have an objective opinion of the tempo that was supposed to be. We can assume the 16th notes are in a certain speed for articulation, but okay, all this is educated guess by very smart and well-versed scholars, but it remains in the hands of us when we play it to make sense of it for ourselves. And the first slow one comes in C sharp minor in book 1. Of course, I assume it is slow, but I think it's because it's reflective, contemplative, singing, lyrical. there for him in his life, which was chaotic. Not only children, students, performances, weekly cantatas, 40 minutes of written music, new every week to bring to the church and to organize, to rehearse, to put together and archive and start anew for each Sunday, and organize masses and play for funerals and for baptisms and for weddings and so whatever, and all this and all that, and travel, and perhaps music at the time, which was not computer organized, thankfully, or perhaps alas for us, archivingly. A lot was lost, some was carefully kept, some was accidentally rediscovered. I really don't know if he had at hand his book 1 in 1720s written, while in 1740s writing a second book of exercises in each of the tonalities in the shape of prelude and fugues. Because you would think some of them mirror each other in terms of genre. This would be in the book 2, Siciliana. The 6/4, also reflective, expressive in the sense of lyrical. Of course, the fugue in book 2 is 16th notes without interruption, no rhythmicity, no rhythmic pattern. Whenever the book 1 is the 5-voice fugue with a long value singing subject, and then the second book's subject is in fact in the type of genre of Sagan's subject in his first book. Very similar to the subject of book 2, but it's the second subject in book 1, where the third subject is definitely rhythmized. Meaning, if not rhythmized, perhaps the right word would be with a defined rhythmic pattern figure that you can recognize, so that when you have the large song subject, and then you have so phenomenally, exponentially expanding with these 3 layers of thematic materials that don't override, they really overlap, really they coat each other. Where he goes. In this case, the fugues were the Bach's essential aim. The prelude was an improvised, or written out obviously in the notated factor, but in an improvised way. It was the establishment of the tonalities, since we didn't have, if we were back in the time, the audacity of writing in C# minor would have escaped us today. But back then it was, and therefore exploring this rare tonality with such a complex fugue demanded for a very reflective and not so driven prelude. I think he might have had that in mind when he combined them, when he paired them himself for each of the two books. He might have thought, and my teacher, Mademoiselle Boulanger, also might think it's ludicrous to even imagine combining them from the two books, and who are we to decide to pair them compared to what he paired? And would have he refused that or refute that as a teaching tool? He who was a pedagogue at heart, while a performer, but mostly even conducting and composing, he's a teacher. He teaches us through his compositions. He teaches us through his performances. He organizes the chaos of nature for us to understand the meaning of how we can exponentially expand our thoughts in a very spiritually elevating, in terms of the religious aspect of his of his inspiration, but as well the industry of playing, the industry of organizing the voices. And so probably he or Mademoiselle Boulanger would have both disagreed with my predicament that we could use a combination of the books in terms of not an aesthetic point of view of rewriting them. It's just a playful, perhaps at best cunning, tender, and in a way to refresh our approach to these pieces for those of us who already learned them the way they were paired. Perhaps it's a pointless exercise ultimately for the aim of it, but I find that it allows to keep one's mind alert, to be a vibrating membrane to all of these expressions that Bach gives us in such plethoric way, organized and pedagogically intended, while at the same time generously spread. It almost seems like Bach's music doesn't start or end. It just sort of departs and interrupts, and we just hop on it or hop out of it. Like something motoric like D minor of Book 2. Compared to the D minor of Book 1. Now I got confused which one was which. It makes me think D minor for us is sad because of the romantic, post-romantic, modern music where minor is a certain kind of sadness and major some kind of hope and joy. And perhaps jubilation even, whatever, but something that connects psychologically to us through the mode, major or minor. I think here they do have a colorization of minor and major. I don't think they have to do with the mode per se. You can have something very thoughtful in major and something very driven in minor, factually. The left hand goes, okay, continue with a circle of fifths. And the right hand, cunning, playful patterns of 3 over the beat so that it constantly connects into a continuous pattern of infinity. 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 la fa ré la fa ré ré si ré si so mi do la fa ré la fa ré la fa ré si ré si so mi do la. It always picks up on the upbeat. It never sits on the downbeat, it rebounces on it like on a trampoline and goes on to the next beat, so you feel like the music is a constant ongoing experience. It's almost a moto perpetual, like a perpetual motion research. Of course, you could say it's breathless. Of course, for musicians who need to breathe, unlike us on the keyboard, it's unplayable, unthinkable. But for the keyboard writing, I think he enjoyed that capacity of implementing a motoric continuum and energy that self empowers itself. It's really very driven, and it doesn't matter that it's in major or minor, as a matter of fact. I think that's what perhaps I can read into the fact that his minor key tonality pieces are not all reflective and sad, and only the major ones driven and jubilant, like G major Book 2. Of course, Book 1 is also driven. And the fugue. That truly is jubilational. And Book 2, it's because he was tired of teaching Book 1 for 20 years. And he renewed it, and perhaps some of the prelude and fugues of Book 1 were more in his mind than the others, or some others, and perhaps he just didn't always have in memorization all of his pieces. Obviously, he was unable to remember all that. Though genius he was, who knows why he couldn't. Perhaps he did. After all, who am I to guess? Or not to hope to guess that. I find that a fascinating well of information in Bach's music. And we think about the lute, we think harpsichord, we think clavichord, we think fortepiano, we think piano, we could think synthesizer, we could think singing, we could think instrumental with other instruments. In fact, it's pure music that doesn't only stop at the instrument for which it's conceived. Of course, it is meant for that in the first place, but it can be all else. And Mozart himself, after visiting Leipzig as a child prodigy, he was given to look at some of the scores of the cantatas which were kept as church archives of Bach's composition. And for the Well-Temperate Bach, of course, Mozart must have exercised playing some of them like they are used for what they were then. Exercises, not only artworks as today we consider them as well. But perhaps there wasn't such a difference then anyway, it was just music. But the point is that he did write. Mozart wrote for a few of the fugues string trios. And so therefore I think that this absolute music is not only limited to the instrument for which it was conceived, but can live on through different variants, as long as you keep cherishing, sharing, and implementing the drive of the shape of the melody of each of the lines in terms of the melodic meaning and expressive choice of leap or step motion, and in which direction and how and what. It should never become verticalized, mechanical, just slices of beats organized by groups of bars and put together. I think it's more about flows and layers and strat in French would be more like the different soil levels when you excavate, when you do archaeology and you go further in time, the deeper you go down because more was added on top. And so in a way I think Bach's music in terms of the texture should be thought more like layers rather than slices. That's a good one, I would say. At least attempt to, because it's easier said than done. And when you go about something as special as a tonality, we said earlier, C sharp major, C sharp minor. Here is D sharp major and D sharp minor, or E flat minor. Some, in this case, in book 1, is the only time he or respells it differently, the notation, and harmonically, when the fugue of book 1 is in D sharp, but the prelude is in E flat. At least notated. I don't think we can hear it, obviously, but we know it when we read it. It's something about our connection to the written material, not to the heard material, which we transmit to the audience the purest, without to add too much as possible, but still implementing ourselves. We should be involved. We shouldn't be uninvolved, a la Urtext. We perhaps it came as a good thing after World War II to publish things minimalistically instead of being overly notated by some musicologists or composers or musicians, editors who over indicated and perhaps shaped it to a 19th century hearing of the 18th century, or a 20th century beginning of hearing of the 19th century. That's probably the reason. But I think as a performer, you want to not overstate, you want to let the music express itself, while you don't want to appear to be uninvolved either. For instance, D sharp minor in book 2. The circle of fifths, and then of course all flows and flows whenever the fugue what can I say? Nothing, except that I speak too much and I don't play enough. I should think, sing, and elaborate more the pieces and hope one day to play them right, even if I recorded them as young, if I studied them as a child. I think as I teach them, I rediscover them. When I share them with you, I rediscover them, and I can hear how the richness, the choices, the simplicity multiplied by many voices of each of the voices, which are individually very simple in the sense of not complicated, but combined create a beautiful complication, which in fact is an elevation of the spirit. I think it is to do with the elevation of the being, becoming better after learning it, becoming with a higher hearing, understanding about nature, humanity, religion, spiritual uplifting. We become better humans after Bach's connection. Would it be as a listener, as a performer, or as a scholar, or as a historian, or as an instrument maker, or as a teacher, or as a tone engineer, or a recording artist, and so many ways. Thank you.